Hello YouTube! Welcome! Today I'll go over the process to design and build your own aquarium stand or rack, and I'll show you how I built my two most recent aquarium racks. The first step is to determine your needs, limitations, and goals. In my experience, the biggest limitation is space. How much room is there? What is the maximum size that'll fit? Take good measurements. Consider the space needed for walkways, maintenance, access to outlets, doors, and windows. Determine the maximum length and width and then subtract an inch or two to account for trim or walls that aren't perfectly straight. A few extra inches of wiggle room can sometimes be the difference between success and failure. If you already have a tank or have an aquarium size in mind, this sets the minimum size. For a rack, you can start to determine how many tanks can be fit within the maximum size. Make sure to add about an inch to the length and the width of each tank when determining if it'll fit. Again, having a lip around the edge is fine, but if you have just a few fractions of an inch too little room, you're in trouble. I've been there. Also, when figuring the height for multi-level racks, make sure to give yourself adequate room above each shelf of tanks. Leave 6 inches clearance above the tank at an absolute minimum, but 9 inches is even more ideal. Also, I try to avoid placing any aquariums at ground level. Having the lowest shelf at least a foot off the floor makes siphoning water much easier and saves a bit of pain in the back and knees. Even if you already have most of the materials, there will probably be some things that you will have to buy. But more importantly, there's a big difference in cost between functional and fancy. You should determine what you're willing to spend on the project ahead of time, as that'll help you decide if the extra trim, hardwoods, or furniture-grade finishings are in scope. For these tank racks, I'm aiming for a primarily functional build. No frills other than a few coats of paint. I am comfortable with woodworking and have the tools to do it. For these racks, you only need a saw and a drill or an electric screwdriver. You could use a hand saw if that's all you can afford, but if you have the skills and the gear to weld up a metal rack, do that. Or if you really have no ability or tools to cut lumber, you could use stacked cinder blocks and have the hardware store cut a few boards to size for you. Cinder blocks are bulky, so you could fit fewer tanks, and it would cost a little more, but it would work. Draft a plan to meet all of these design considerations. When planning the build, one important detail is that it must be sturdy. Figure about 10 pounds per gallon for each tank. So for a 10-gallon tank, that's not so bad. But for 120, that's a lot of weight. A potentially deadly amount of weight. Wood can hold a lot. A 2x4 is very sturdy. Consider the walls of your house. In most cases, there's no need to go with any larger lumber. The main issue isn't holding the tank up, it's preventing skew. It must be able to handle getting pushed from the side. Adding some plywood to the back and the sides is a great way to prevent this. You can also add cross bracing. For smaller tanks, like the 10 and 20 gallon tanks that I'm going to be using here, it's enough to use multiple screws and glue in addition to strapping the stand to the wall. Another issue is sag. This isn't an issue for a single tank, but if you have many tanks spanning a shelf, the wood can sag in the center, which isn't ideal. The thicker and the wider the lumber, the more weight it can support without sagging. Large tanks, 40 gallons or larger, should have a vertical support near each corner. When using 2x4 construction for multi-tank shelves, keep the span under 3 feet. Now draw it up. Having at least a rough blueprint will help prevent many mistakes and will help you determine how much lumber you need. I like to use Visio, but there's many CAD options. If nothing else, use pencil and paper. Buy or gather all the tools and materials you're going to need. For these two racks, I need 12 8-foot 2x4s. I went ahead and got 13 to be safe. Wood glue, 2.5-inch deck screws, and some paint. For tools, I need my saw and cordless screwdriver, a square, measuring tape, and some painting supplies. With a good plan, I like to cut all the lumber at once. Measure twice and double check yourself. If it's your first time building this, you might cut each piece as you go, just so you can check that it all fits together as expected. Either way, it's good to make sure each set of legs are the same size. Having one leg a bit longer than the others can be a problem later. I assemble the ends first. Set down 2 legs flat and place the top spanner. Measure the height of the shelf and mark that on the legs. Then set the bottom spanner over that mark. Pre-drill 3 screw holes in a diagonal line across the end of each spanner. Square it up the best you can, then attach the 2 spanners with glue and 1 screw in the middle on each end. You should be able to wiggle it or skew it now, which is fine, because we want to make sure it's perfectly square. While the glue is still wet, use your square and go around the corners adjusting as needed to get the structure square. Once you're happy with it, put in the other 2 screws at each end. Now it's secure. Having one complete and perfect, I use it as my template for the next 3. I do double check the measurement for the shelf and spot check the squares, but this goes pretty quick. Now install the top and bottom horizontals. I take the completed end pieces and set them on their sides in the garage floor. I pre-drill and pre-start screws at the end of each horizontal and then apply some glue, line it up with the shelf and attach it. Square it and repeat the process from the bottom. Then flip it over and repeat for the other side. Now place it upright, check your square again, and glue and screw in the center shelf. Now it's built. Time to add the finishing touches. Give it a good furniture look by sanding it down and staining and sealing it. But in this case, I just want to protect the wood a little bit, so a coat of exterior paint is used. Check your discount or return aisle in the paint section of your hardware store. They seem to always have a can or 3 of off-white or nearly black at a huge discount. Normally that's it for the build, but I've got a bunch of extra OSB, so I'll use it for the top. I cut it, fit it in place, secure it with a few 1.5-inch screws every few feet. And for heavy tanks, adding it or plywood to the sides and back would add a lot to the structural strength. But for these stands, I really don't need that. Now get a friend and put it in place. The room I'm using has sloped floors, so I hammer some shims in under the corners to level it up. Once I've got it level and where I want it, I use some strapping and screws to secure it to the wall, just in case someone tries to climb it or pull it over. The stand is now complete, but I find it much easier, and probably safer, to install the lights and air lines before I put the tanks on it. A few zip ties and cable tacks can really help tidy it all up and make the lines look good. The tanks are then rinsed out and placed in position. I'll be using matte filters for these tanks. I have a whole other video covering the process to build them. One goes in each tank and then the air lines are connected. Finally, the tanks are filled. I adjust the air to get each tank running like I want, check the water, add acid as needed to bring the pH and carbonate hardness down. Our tap water is liquid rock. After a day, I'll add the chlorinator and then some gunk from my other established tanks and some fish food to get them cycling. And in 2 weeks, they're going to be ready for fish. All done. As always, please post any suggestions or questions in the comments. Click like if you like this, and subscribe to see more. And until next time, thanks for watching.